Dr. N. Sreekumar is an assistant professor of philosophy in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, Indian Institute of Technology, Madras. He is a gold medalist for MA Philosophy from the Mahatma Gandhi University, Kottayam. He did his MPhil and PhD in philosophy from the Central University of Hyderabad and specializes in the areas of philosophy of language, continental philosophy, and hermeneutics. He has been into the academic profession since 1995 and has taught in Sri Shankaracharya University of Sanskrit, Kaladi, Kerala and BITS Pilani, Rajasthan before joining the IIT Madras in 2003. Dr. Sreekumar has published articles in various journals and has presented papers in national and international seminars. Some of the courses he offers include European Philosophy, Contemporary German Philosophy, Introduction to Indian Philosophy, Philosophical Hermeneutics, Philosophy and Critical Theory, and Philosophy of Language.
Welcome to the UGC lecture series in philosophy on the course Phenomenology and Existentialism Part 2. In the last episode we have seen we were trying to place or locate, see the conceptual environment in which phenomenology and existentialism in European philosophy is placed, so that we will get a better picture. And in this episode we will cover the following topics. We have seen the nature of German philosophy briefly. Here we will see one more important aspects about German philosophy, particularly in the post-Kantian era, the nationalization of philosophy. Here again the emphasis will be on the post-Kantian thought in German philosophy, because Kant, as we have seen earlier, was a very important figure, very influential philosopher. So he has changed the whole direction in which philosophers have carried out their thinking process, and post-Kantian philosophy is a major philosophical trend in European philosophy. We will also see some movements in German philosophy, and there we will have a look at phenomenology and German philosophy. Finally, on Husserl's philosophy, because Edmund Husserl, the German mathematician and philosopher, is considered as the founder of phenomenology. So before going to that, we will see the nationalization of philosophy. This is a major shift in the whole idea how Europe has conceived philosophy, because in traditional philosophy, for nearly 1000 years, Latin was considered as the language of philosophy, science and knowledge. This was particularly because of the domination of the Catholic Church in the intellectual milieu of Europe. But this has ceased to be the situation. This situation has changed in the 18th century onwards, where Latin ceased to be the language of scientific world and also of philosophy. Philosophy suddenly began to speak in the vernacular, particularly in Germany and France. Philosophy have started writing their works in their mother tongue. This was not the case earlier, and philosophy again ceased to be cosmopolitan in character, and racial and national traits started dominating during this period. This is very important because philosophy gained a local status also in Europe's intellectual environment. Now we will see some characteristic features of post-Kantian philosophy. Here, after Kant, we could see that there is a list, there is a series of thinkers, there are a number of thinkers who dominated the intellectual milieu of Western thought. German philosophy absolutely dominated in almost all areas of thought, like Kant, Hegel, Karl Marx, Schopenhauer, Friedrich Nietzsche, Gottlob Frege, Wittgenstein. A list of philosophers are Germans. And one more aspect of German philosophy is the idealism, the predominant idealism. Idealism was so prominent in German philosophy, which is not the case with Anglo-Saxon thought. Even today, we could see the traits of idealistic thinking in very strong traits of idealistic in German and continental philosophy. Then again, philosophy, if you really try to understand German thought, even contemporary German thought and continental philosophy, by contrasting it with analytical philosophy of Anglo-Saxon tradition, philosophers of like Bertrand Russell, even the contemporary thinkers like W.V. Quine, Donald Davidson and Putnam, Kripke and all that, there we can see that the continental philosophers, there is a conscious attempt to relate philosophy with human life and human problems, which is not the case predominantly with the analytical philosophers, though they also deal with human reality in a very major way and in a very significant manner. This is not to say that they are not concerned about human reality or human world, but the emphasis is more in the continental tradition, particularly in the German philosophical traditions. Now again, German philosophy is rich with its variety. There are a lot of trends, various philosophers have come up with various pictures of reality, various styles of philosophizing. So this variety we cannot see in any other traditions since 18th century onwards. And again, another prominent trend is an emphasis on historicism, particularly after Hegel, because Hegel's philosophy emphasized on the historicity of, though he was an idealist to the core, at the same time there was an emphasis on historicism. So after Hegel, this tradition, this trend, this emphasis on historicity was prominent in German philosophy. Now we will see some of the movements in German philosophy, some very important conceptual movements that has taken place in German philosophy. The prominent one is definitely idealism, where people like Kant and Hegel were considered as the most prominent thinkers. Kant's idealism and Hegel's absolutism. Then materialism is another major trend, where the most important thinkers are definitely Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels. They have inaugurated a new style of doing philosophy. They have related materialism with the whole tradition of philosophy, and they were trying to interpret the very historical process, the very process of evolution of humankind through history in terms of materialistic principles. Now comes phenomenology, one of the most significant and important conceptual movements in Western thought, and as I have said earlier, the major proponent of this tradition is Edmund Husserl. Now hermeneutics is another trend, because any mention on German philosophy cannot avoid mentioning hermeneutics, and how phenomenology itself has developed into a phenomenological hermeneutics. The phenomenology of Husserl, the project of Husserl was carried out further by his disciple, one time disciple, and later became a critic, Martin Heidegger, who has developed it into further into a phenomenological hermeneutics. And other thinkers like Gadamer, Hans Georg Gadamer, and the one of the, or rather the most important living philosopher, Habermas. So this is to show how rich is German philosophical traditions even in the contemporary period. Now we have to mention critical theory, another important movement in which is originated in continental philosophy and particularly in German culture. Existentialism, of course, I have already mentioned. Though Heidegger is not an existentialist in the traditional sense of the word, the whole movement of existentialism owe a lot to Heidegger's philosophy, Heidegger's phenomenological hermeneutics and phenomenology of the Sein, the being of man, being in the world. Now we will see phenomenology and German philosophy, because here phenomenology can be placed in the context of German philosophy as a reaction against certain widely prevailing trends in German philosophical traditions. The first one is naturalism, which claims that only the physical is real. Only the physical is real. It tries to explain the whole of reality, including human reality, in terms of physical laws and physical principles. So, here it fails to see the real nature of experience. This is the major criticism phenomenologists and other philosophers raise against naturalism. Naturalism, though it gives a fairly good account about physical reality, it fails to see the significance of human experience, nature of human experience. Another major philosophical trend to which phenomenology quarreled is historicism, which I have already mentioned about historicism. But historicism in one sense claims that there is nothing stable and it denies that possibility of any objective truth at all. So, historicism is again, it denies the very possibility of truth, it denies the possibility of objectivity in our arguments, and in that sense it denies the very validity of knowledge as the term is understood in the traditional philosophical sense. So, phenomenology quarrels with both historicism and naturalism in one sense, and further it quarrels against idealism, pointing out its excessive subjectivity, the emphasis on subjectivity. Now, we will see naturalism a little detail. As I have already said, here there is an explanation of everything in terms of physical laws, and it fails to see the value of subjectivity, human subjectivity. This is very important because phenomenologists were concerned about consciousness, or there is a conscious attempt to place human consciousness at the center of everything as a foundation of every knowledge, which means that phenomenologists cannot ignore the value of subjectivity. So, naturalism in one sense fails to see the value of subjectivity, and it also fails to explain the uniqueness of consciousness. So, this is another, and when it comes to historicism, this again overemphasis on historicity, everything is part of the historical process. So, everything is a flex, this is being questioned, and everything including truth is part of the historical flex. This is another theory which is opposed, and there is no firm foundation as far as historicism is concerned. They deny the possibility of any firm foundation because everything is part of the historical process. Now, we will see idealism, and it places the human subject at the center of knowledge, and it opposes dogmatic objectivism, but due to its excessive subjectivism, phenomenologists found objection in idealistic trends. With this, we will have a short break, and afterwards we will see the methodology of phenomenology in detail. We will now see the methodological aspects of this movement called phenomenology very briefly, as we are going to see it in detail later. So, here this question of methodology or method in philosophy has been raised by many philosophers, predominantly by philosophers of modern period like Descartes, Spinoza and all that, probably because of their influence. They were influenced by science and the methodology of science. Similarly, Husserl also was concerned about methodological problems, because he also believed that philosophy or phenomenology can be a foundational discipline only if there is a proper methodology. So, here the methods of psychology and sociology are being referred. It is not that the phenomenologists were adopting the methods of psychology and sociology, but they have taken insights from the methodological approaches of psychology and sociology. And there is always an attempt to describe experience, description of experience. This is another way in which phenomenologists distinguish themselves from others. They were trying to focus on human experience and try to give a description of human experience. Analyze the intellectual process of which we are introspectively aware without making any assumptions about their causal links to external object. this intellectual process of which we are introspectively aware. This is a very major aspect, very major point to be reminded, because this is one the whole concept of phenomena and the whole notion of knowledge which is based on this concept of phenomena is derived from this idea. We will examine this later in detail when we see Husserl's methodology in detail. Now we will start our discussion of phenomenology here. Here this is Edmund Husserl, who is one of the major, very important philosophers, one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century, who is widely considered as the founder of phenomenology. Though we cannot say that he was the founder of phenomenology in the strict sense, but still all major contributions in this area are from Husserl. And phenomenology's role in German philosophy, could see that even prior to Husserl itself, there were references to phenomenology and phenomenological approaches in the history of Western philosophy and also in German philosophy. Many references to the term phenomenology in the philosophy of Lambert, Immanuel Kant, Fichte, Hegel and Ernst Mach. And even Husserl himself acknowledges, particularly Mach, when he discusses how he developed this concept of consciousness, awareness and all that, and also to philosophers like Hegel and Kant. But as I said earlier, all major contributions in this area are from Edmund Husserl. So we can reasonably consider Edmund Husserl as the founder of phenomenology. Then Husserl's phenomenology. If you really focus on Husserl's phenomenology, we can see that he started his career as a mathematician. He was basically a mathematician and he has produced some work in mathematics, and this interest in mathematics probably had led him to philosophy through logic. So he studied philosophy with Franz Brentano and was influenced by Brentano as well as David Hume. We will see the influences of these two important philosophers. Brentano, he is more a psychologist than a philosopher, and David Hume, the great empiricist philosopher, British empiricist philosopher. We will see their contributions in detail later. And again, we have already seen this aspect. He has opposed the naturalism and historicism which was prominent in German philosophy. Now let us see the route to phenomenology, how Husserl has really reached phenomenology from starting his career as a mathematician. And he was particularly interested in exploring the role played by psychology in the understanding of numbers, because as a mathematician he was concerned about these conceptual issues related to the whole concept of numbers. So from here he was trying to see the role played by psychology in the understanding of numbers, and this has led him to the inquiry into the foundations of mathematics, and which ultimately led him to logic, because as everybody knows, the foundations of mathematics lie in logic, and logic is traditionally understood as a science of reasoning, science of human thinking and all that. It deals with a set of rules which will distinguish right reasoning from wrong reasoning, and finally from logic to epistemology, and then epistemology to philosophy and phenomenology. For Husserl, philosophy was phenomenology. So the route is from mathematics to logic, logic to epistemology, epistemology to philosophy, and philosophy to phenomenology. See, here Husserl devised, or according to Husserl, there are three ways to conceive phenomenology. The first is phenomenology will provide foundation for philosophy. See, here again Husserl is echoing an age old philosophic concern of all philosophers, that philosophers from time immemorial were trying to conceive their discipline, philosophy, as a special science, as a foundational discipline, which is different from other sciences. It is a science, but definitely different from other sciences. It is a science because they wanted to assert that it is a rational endeavor. Philosophy employs speculation, it relies on speculation a lot, like religion and theology, but the major difference is that in philosophy the speculation is rational. This has been the traditional ideal about philosophy. Now here phenomenology, when Husserl conceived phenomenology as providing a foundation for philosophy, he was also thinking in terms of his traditional predecessors who conceived philosophy as a foundational discipline. It is a science of all sciences. This was again a traditional conception, a science of sciences according to Husserl. Philosophy is, because it provides foundation to sciences, a concept which we will see later, because one aspect which Husserl was repeatedly emphasizing is that phenomenology is a presuppositionless philosophy. It is expected to provide ultimate foundations for all thinking, for all sciences and for all knowledge. So philosophy has to be a true science, a true foundational discipline. And here again he raises the issue of consciousness, to discover the basis of consciousness, because as I mentioned some time back, the focus on consciousness is something which makes phenomenology distinct from many other traditions of thought. On the one hand, phenomenology emphasizes on objectivity and subscribe to many traditional ideals like objective knowledge. Rather, it redefines the whole concept of objectivity into intersubjectivity, but still there is a concept of knowledge, there is a concept of human understanding which is rational, and all these in one sense is based on his theory of consciousness. So it is so central to Husserl's philosophy. The whole notion of consciousness he develops is central to Husserl's phenomenology. And the second point, where philosophy again echoing the traditional concern, or phenomenology as a role of first philosophy. This is a term which he has taken from a concept, an idea which he has taken from Aristotle, who has really introduced this concept of first philosophy. So phenomenology for Husserl was a first philosophy, because it is a foundational discipline. It has to be a first philosophy, and phenomenology as coextensive with philosophy, because for him philosophy is phenomenology. The third point is phenomenology as a transcendental idealism. This is in his later period. Husserl has become more, he has exhibited, or rather he was emphasizing more on the transcendental aspects of philosophy and thinking, and he has conceived, he was highlighting the whole concept of transcendental ego, which is derived as the result of a bracketing process, which we will see later. So phenomenology as a transcendental idealism, where all meaning had its source in the transcendental ego. This is a later development in Husserl's phenomenology. As I said earlier, phenomenology is a very important movement in Western thought, because it breaks from many traditional concerns and the inauguration of a new way of thinking in Western philosophy. Many traditional concerns were challenged, were opposed and overthrown, and inauguration of a new way of thinking. And it has influenced many movements in philosophy like existentialism, hermeneutics and all that. We can see that in existentialism itself, as I have mentioned some time earlier, the philosophy of Heidegger, for example, can be considered as a direct offshoot of Heidegger's response, or rather critical response to Husserl's phenomenology. Heidegger was Husserl's student, but later on deviated from the teachings, from the main teachings of his teacher, and developed a phenomenological hermeneutics with a focus on the question of being. And even in the philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre have always repeatedly mentioned or repeatedly acknowledged his indebtedness to Husserl's phenomenology. So the movement called phenomenology has been so influential in the Western world, in the Western philosophical tradition, history of Western philosophy. So to conclude with, we have seen that we have our attempt to place phenomenology in the context of contemporary and traditional philosophical discussions in Western tradition. We have seen that Husserl and his phenomenology occupies a major place in Western philosophy. He has assimilated many insights which were widely discussed by thinkers and traditional as well as philosophers of his contemporary age, and also incorporated insights from other disciplines like mathematics, logic and sciences into his philosophy, developing his philosophical thought, and how he has influenced other thinkers, other philosophies like hermeneutics, existentialism, etc., etc. So, before we conclude, there are some questions which students can take. What is the importance of phenomenology? What is the role of phenomenology in Western philosophy or in contemporary German philosophy? What are the philosophical movements which were influenced by phenomenology, and what is the importance given by phenomenology to the concept of consciousness? So, in the subsequent lectures we will see the influence on Husserl, the thinkers who have influenced Husserl, because to develop his philosophy, to develop his phenomenology, particularly his concept of consciousness, his concept of suspension of beliefs and all that, he was considerably influenced by many thinkers like Brentano, David Hume, Descartes, Immanuel Kant and all that. So, we will see this later, and the fundamental objectives of phenomenology with the whole concept of phenomenology as a rigorous science, and with a focus on the concept of phenomena and with an emphasis on the notion of consciousness. We will have all these in the subsequent lectures. Thank you.